Are people really engaged in local politics? Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and this hour, that's the question we're tackling. In under 30 days, voters will cast ballots in an ever-important midterm election, and we're hearing a lot about different voting groups being energized or riled up. What does that mean? My guest this hour is Danks Burke of the Trailblazers PAC. They're dedicated to transparency in campaign finance and work with candidates and voters alike to educate across the region. We have plenty to get to this hour, so I want to get right to it. But first, a quick word from today's show sponsor. Inside the FLX and other programming on FingerLakes1.com is made possible by local sponsors supporting local reporting. Learn more about advertising on Finger Lakes One by clicking on the Advertise button at the bottom of our homepage.
I was severely injured. I was on a ventilator. My husband was scared and he just went for the nearest number that he had heard advertised over and over and figured they're the best, they know what they're doing. I think that's the typical reaction, but unfortunately it wasn't the right one. And I'm thankful that we learned that early on in the process. He decided to look for someone locally who would give us a little more personalized attention. And when we met Steve and talked with him, we knew that we had found that person. If you want to feel like you have an attorney who's in your corner, who's going to listen to you, who's going to endeavor to understand you, give Steve a call. I really felt like everyone at Madej, Mears, and Rickey really cared.
For a law firm that cares about you, contact Madej, Mears, and Rickey at 315-568-0911. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.
Over the last year, but we're in the heart of election season now. Give me a sense of what you're feeling or seeing right now, just in terms of political action, and then also the sort of campaign finance side of it as well. Folks are starting to get a little better educated in terms of what they're expecting out of candidates, right?
Well, yeah, and the political engagement on all ends of the political spectrum, and I don't think it's just a left-right spectrum anymore either. I mean, we've got a full sphere of people's opinions out there, and at all corners of the sphere, we are seeing just enormous political engagement. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's what democracy and our democratic republic is supposed to be about. We're all supposed to participate. So that's exciting. But yes, on the fundraising side and on the campaign finance side, you see that mirrored as well. And there's huge dollar figures flowing into races all across the country, in New York State, all over the country. And then the corollary to that is that some candidates who are running for offices that, you know, might be interesting and it might be worthwhile to see an actual debate happening, they're not able to get the attention of the big dollars. And, that voice is ending up getting drowned out. So I find that fascinating. So
talk to us a little bit about the access to those big dollars, because it does seem to some extent it is still required in some aspects to really get that attention. The big money, we see it in the larger races rather than the smaller, more rural races. But at the same time, with the work you guys are doing at the Trailblazers PAC, that has to be a concern, but you must be happy with the progress you're seeing.
Well, I don't know about happy, but one of the interesting things that we just discovered is that $1 in $8 in New York State races, and that's, races at the county level, at the town level, at the village level, $1 in $8 comes from so-called unitemized sources. And those are sources that aren't disclosed at all. It's aggregated together into a big pot, and the county committee or the candidate himself or herself has to disclose that he or she has received this pot of money, but doesn't have to say where it came from, as long as it came in a collection of small donations. And so it turns out that $1 in $8 in New York State politics comes through this small donation portal, which means that you don't have to disclose where it came from. And it makes you raise an eyebrow, right? We're talking about $240 million in 2017 total raised, and of that, $31 million came through undisclosed sources. No one knows where those dollars came from.
And I would imagine for some people, especially those who aren't necessarily as engaged as some other folks might be, they're probably scratching their head saying, how is that even possible?
How does it matter? Oh, how is it even possible?
How is it even possible?
That's interesting. And then other people say, why does it even matter, right? Okay, so the way the rule works is if you, usually in most races, if you donate $99 or less to a candidate, then the candidate doesn't have to say where the money came from. So, you have a fundraiser and everybody throws $5 into the hat. You don't have to say individually where all those $5 came from. You just aggregate them all together and you say it's an undisclosed, unitemized contribution. Well, that makes sense. It seems reasonable that you wouldn't have to tally up all those little bitty donations. But once they start totaling a full eighth of all the dollars, once they add up to $31 million, it becomes a little bit of a head scratcher, and you wonder, are those really all donations that came in under $99? Or are we just saying that they are? Who is it that's giving $99 over and over and over to total up to $31 million? That's pretty extraordinary. So you just start wondering where that money is.
And I guess the follow-up to that is there a way to really, unless you're going to change the policy and change the rules of engagement, is there really any way to root that out or to eliminate it?
Well, of course, what we do at Trailblazers is we ask our candidates to disclose it anyway, even though the state law doesn't require you to. We ask our candidates to tell their voters where all of their money comes from. We don't have an opinion really on where their money comes from, other than that we want to see at least a portion of it come from actual voters. We don't want to see candidates funded entirely by corporate interests. They have to get at least a small amount of money from their actual voters in order to be a Trailblazers candidate. But as long as they do that, we don't care where the money comes from. We just think the voters should know where it comes from, that information should be out there.
Now, do you prescribe to the logic? Because I've heard some folks, will post a political story on Facebook and you'll see this really intense debate about politics break out and how the finances should work. Every now and then you'll hear people say, well, there should be a set amount of money that each candidate has to work with, and that's it. There shouldn't be anything else involved, because then you start to bring in personal interest and things like that. Is that really a sensible way to deal with the campaign finance problem that we clearly do have to some degree?
We've clearly got a campaign finance problem, and it's on both sides of the aisle. The Democrats are culpable, and the Republicans are culpable too. The real challenge that you want to ask yourself is, when does that cross the free speech line, right? And it's clear that money amplifies speech, right? If you're wanting to shout on the street corner and I'm wanting to shout on the opposite street corner, and I can buy a soapbox and you can't, then my voice is going to carry farther than your voice. And the Supreme Court has said that's allowed. You're allowed to spend money to amplify your voice. And the question in campaign finance is, how far do we let that go? How much money can you spend? And can corporations also spend money, or can only people spend money to amplify their voice? So that's the debate we're having in politics right now. And what we're trying to do at Trailblazers PAC is step back from policy prescriptions and step back from trying to say what the law should be, and ask candidates to just be good people. Just view the law as a floor rather than a ceiling. Do more than the law requires. Let your voters know where your money comes from. It makes you a good person, and excitingly, it also makes you more likely to win. So might as well do better than the law requires.
So that was going to be the next question. More likely to win based on what I would assume be positive feedback from voters, right? Like there's a connection.
There's a connection. And the other thing is, once you fund your campaign with your own voters, once you have the people whose interests you're supposed to represent paying for your soapbox, as it were, paying for your yard signs, paying for your ads in the penny saver, whatever it is that you're using to get your voice out there, once you have your own voters paying for that, they become invested in the campaign. They get bought into the campaign. We use those words, right? Those financial words to talk about people buying into an idea. And you want your voters to be bought into your ideas, right? That's how you win a race. That's how you get people to the polls and make sure that they're going to check your name when they're going down the list of options.
So I have to ask, because part of this all sort of hinges on getting people engaged and getting people talking about politics and voting and even actually running. Are we making progress and actually, and I'd say this well beyond just the scope of what you guys are doing at the Trailblazers PAC, but in general, are we improving on getting people engaged in politics to a point where they're actually able to make a difference in a real tangible way? We don't see great voter turnout. We see in rural communities where the bench too of potential candidates, that list seems to keep shrinking rather than growing. Where are we right now, and have we gotten better, I guess, would be the logical question that a lot of people are probably wondering about.
I think we've gotten better over the last 2 years compared to where we were 3 or 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. But if you want to look in the aggregate where we are now versus where we were 100 years ago, 150 years ago, if you're looking at the population of people who are allowed to vote, now recognize that 150 years ago, the population of people who were allowed to vote in the first place was significantly smaller, right?
Yeah.
Women weren't allowed to vote. People of color were not allowed to vote. So when you look at the population of people who are allowed to vote, the goal of a democratic republic is to get the number of people within that population as high as possible who are actually participating. And we're not doing as well as we were formerly. And I think that we could do better. And I think that our founding fathers are probably frowning on us a little bit for how few of us participate in politics as part of our everyday life.
And I have to ask, has the pitch changed in terms of, someone who's right on the fence, they're close to maybe thinking about running for a town board or village board or something like that. Does the pitch have to change as our political climate in the national and state and even the regional seems to continue to get more and more polarized?
That's a really interesting question, Josh. I think, I don't know if my pitch changes. I'm constantly trying to get more people involved, but I think that the folks who are coming to the table seeking to get involved, their reasons for coming to the table change. I know that there are, obviously after President Trump was elected, there were a lot of folks who were really disappointed with that decision and got involved in politics because they didn't like who the president was. There were a lot of people before Donald Trump was elected on the right who were really disappointed with the idea of Hillary Clinton becoming president, and they got very, very engaged because they were watching the national scene and they wanted to get involved, and they ended up getting involved locally. So I think people come to the table sometimes because of a change at the top, but really the pitch is that local office holders are closest to you. They're the people who decide where your kids are going to go to school. They're the people who decide whether your road is going to be paved or not, whether, how long of a commute are you going to have, and are there going to be businesses in your neighborhood? Those are big decisions. What's your house going to be worth? Is there going to be a huge corporation next door to your house or not? Is there going to be a dump down the block or not? Those are questions that your local officials make. And once people get into politics, I think they start realizing that those, frankly, are the decisions that are going to be most important in people's day-to-day lives.
It does. Do you think it takes more of an issue now, an individual issue, to get people engaged rather than just the whole grand concept of
civic
being involved?
Engagement? And
yeah,
I think we've lost a sense of duty in America. There's not really a sense in American culture anymore. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. That sort of went by the wayside at the end of the 20th century. And, so that's not what's propelling people to get involved. I think it's more a self-interest, is this going to affect me in the short term or the long term?
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to talk a little bit just the prospect of what's been referred to repeatedly as a blue wave. Obviously, midterm elections, so the cable news stations need something interesting to talk about, I guess. So the blue wave is the term that's been thrown out at. Agree, disagree, or somewhere in the middle that this is something that could potentially happen. Obviously, nobody knows what's going to happen on Election Day, but just in terms of what you've seen and sort of the interaction, is it possible, or if it does happen, is it just a matter of simple the ebb and flow of politics? When one party is in power, there seems to usually be a ripple effect on the other side of the pond.
I think that waves are never as big as they look when you're standing there on the coast and watching it come at you. I've stood at the side of the ocean and dove into waves before, and sometimes they're not nearly as exciting as they look when they're coming at you. The Democratic Republic of the United States of America is a very big ship. and it takes a long time and a lot of energy to turn. It doesn't turn on a dime, and that is, that's part of the genius of it, that was built into our checks and balances system. So I think that the lesson for a lot of folks is going to be get engaged and stay engaged, because that's how you make a real difference, right? That it's not about a horse race. It's not about a single candidate or a single election. It's about a process. It's about staying involved through the course of your life, because it's our civic responsibility to take care of each other and figure out how we're going to get through this life on this planet that we're all doing together.
So let's shift gears a little bit and actually talk about some of these races.
Sure.
The two regionally, locally, that I think a lot of folks are looking at, obviously incumbents Tom Reed and John Katko both being challenged. One of those races seems a little more plausible to flip, while the other one, just the sheer numbers of it doesn't really seem to suggest it'll happen. Looking at it from the outside, what is your perspective thus far on those races, and how does it relate to what people are feeling and seeing on a daily basis?
Well, you pointed out the Katko district is a much tighter district, right? And that district has flipped back and forth in the past. It sometimes is held by a Democrat, sometimes is held by a Republican. And Mr. Katko, of course, is a relatively moderate Republican himself. And so that makes it even more interesting for people to sort of check the horse race betting on. So I think that probably will be a much tighter race. That said, we're seeing a lot of upsets this year. We're seeing a lot of energy and change happening, and the energy that I'm seeing in New York's 23rd district, which is where my home is, and also where my workplace is really pretty extraordinary. So I think that it's a possibility in any individual congressional race, even a race like the 23rd, where obviously the numbers prefer a Republican, but it's always possible that a Democrat could bust through that and win that race. And I think Tracy Matrano is doing a really good job of running very, very hard, and she's certainly raised a lot of money.
Is that a product of there just being so much rural territory in the district? Because it seems to be there is a lot of focus on sort of the metro centers, where the urban centers are in that district in particular. But it seems like the vast majority of the rural population feels a more one-sided territory. Does it ever confuse you in terms of what the engagement is like leading up to the actual election? Because it seems there's a disconnect between who actually decides in November and what people spend a lot of time focusing on. Extreme ethical liberal is that phrase that I keep hearing over and over again, but I've continued to feel like Ithaca won't have as much of an impact on this race as the rest of the district will.
Well, it is interesting to me how the political parties tend to move in on races that seem close to the margins, right? So let's compare, for example, the New York State gubernatorial race. And if you look at how much money Governor Cuomo has managed to raise, I think he was up to $31 million at one point. He spent a significant amount of that through his primary race against Cynthia Nixon, but he's still got gobs of money in the bank account against Molinaro. Yeah. And the last number that I saw for Molinaro, I think, was around $250,000 that he's got in the bank. So, there's just a huge disparity of money on Cuomo's side versus Molinaro's side. And it doesn't look to me like the Republican Party is stepping in to try to, make that any more balanced. You see the same thing happen when a Republican is likely to prevail and has a whole lot more assets on his or her side. You don't see the Democrats stepping in to even that out. Right? And the folks who lose then are the voters, because you see a huge thumb on the scale keeping the imbalance even more in the direction that it's already imbalanced. And so those of us who are out here participating in the system and wanting to see at least a fair playing field, right? I mean, we at least want to see the two teams playing on a field that isn't tilted in one direction or another, even if it's going to be a ball game where one team completely wins, we lose out. We don't get to see the actual contest happen.
Is that the party figures in that sense spending the money where they feel like their dollar will go the furthest and it potentially have the best outcome, meaning a win?
I think so, and I think where their dollar will go the furthest is sometimes a euphemism for where it's easiest to win the race. But the thing is, this isn't a horse race. This isn't a ball game. This is lives. This is our democracy at stake. It's not supposed to be about where it's easiest. It's supposed to be about all the people, regardless of where they live. And so when I see the Republican Party ignoring urban areas, or I see the Democratic Party ignoring rural areas, I kind of wonder what's going into the decision-making process there that they decided to write off a whole swath of people.
And that's got to be probably the most puzzling development in modern politics, period, because that is something that throughout my time as being a registered voter of age, that has been the trend. One party ignores one group, the other party ignores the other group. Does that say that the party structure, the two dominant party structure, is broken to some degree or just not working? Because I was talking to a friend a couple days ago, and this sort of got to this point where we were saying there's like four parties right now: the far left, the far right, the traditional left, and the traditional right. And it's become almost to a point where you can't even really recognize what's what or who's where. Does the system need to be completely overhauled on that front, on the actual party structure side?
Well, I know that I'm playing the same tune over and over here, but I think it's about the money. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we can fix the funding, we can fix everything. Once you have way too much money coming in to imbalance one side versus the other side, the people who lose end up being the voters. So I think that Americans are spread along a spectrum. I think that's natural. If you line up 25 people, they're going to have 25 different opinions on anything. You're not going to find 25 people who exactly agree with each other. So there's always going to be a spectrum, and people individually have to find their spot within the spectrum among the choices that are offered. But once there's huge amounts of money and power going into shoehorning people into particular views and saying, you don't get to be a part of this club if you have this view, and you can't be a part of that club if you don't have this view, that's problematic. That's not what a free exchange of ideas is supposed to be about.
So let's talk a little bit about the governor's race. What have you seen, obviously, beyond the money, the money portion of it? Is this, do you think, the most realistic challenge that Governor Cuomo has faced thus far in terms of what could possibly happen? Is it conceivable now that he could lose this race?
It is always conceivable, right? I think that the fact that the Working Families Party has now relinquished the line for Cynthia Nixon and has given that line over to Governor Cuomo, I think that really tilts the balance in favor of Governor Cuomo, because before that happened, there was a possibility that Cynthia Nixon would stay on the ballot in November and would possibly pull votes away from Governor Cuomo. And if he were having votes pulled away from him on the left for Cynthia Nixon supporters who wanted to continue to vote for her on the Working Families Party line, and also on the right there's a couple of candidates on the right? There's the Libertarian candidate and there's also the Republican candidate. With that sort of split, you can see a Pataki-style win, right? Where Governor Pataki became governor because of a split in the left. Given that the Working Families Party line has now been given to Governor Cuomo, I think that's significantly less likely at this point.
So before we start to wrap up here, what are some of the races that you've been watching that maybe folks aren't necessarily paying that much attention to but are super important, and whether it's local or regional?
I think that the races that are really, really interesting right now all across Western New York are the primary races, especially the ones where the two primary opponents are now going on to face each other in the general election. And we're seeing that happen more and more often in local races. one where the two are not continuing on is the Ontario County Sheriff race, for example. And there was a Republican primary in the Ontario County Sheriff's race, and that was a battle, it looked like, from the outside for the heart and soul of the Ontario County Republican Committee. Was the Ontario County Republicans going to stick with a sort of, moderate approach in the vein of, Congressman Amo Houghton, for example, a Rockefeller Republican, or were we going to see a shift toward a much more right-wing version of Republicanism? And that's what ended up winning out in the Ontario County Sheriff primary. So I find that very interesting. In Chemung County, we see some of those same battles between Republicans happening, but the loser in the primary managed to gain another line. So the loser in the Republican primary maybe gained a Conservative Party line, or he gained the Independence Party line. And so those two Republicans who just duked it out in the primary are going to show up together on the general election ballot, fighting over the same turf again. And that, I think, is really interesting, because then you're going to have Democrats weighing in on a race that's actually between two Republicans.
And that sort of cross-party pollination, I guess I'll call it, is that the sort of next step in politics, just in terms of where we're headed, where people don't necessarily fit into the traditional boxes anymore, so they're kind of looking elsewhere for candidates that maybe align with them a little better?
I think that to the extent the political parties are boxing themselves up, yeah, they're going to start losing people. And there is a battle right now for the heart and soul of each of the political parties and what that political party stands for. My own particular view is that in the long run, the party that chooses to place moneyed interests over the interests of voters is going to end up suffocating. They're going to self-destruct. They're not going to be able to get the voters to support that agenda. When we saw President Trump elected in 2016, he ran on a platform of draining the swamp. He ran on a platform of getting money out of politics, not making politics entirely about the guy with the most money wins. That's what he said he was doing. Now, I haven't seen the action behind that in the last 2 years, and I think that people are starting to wake up to that a little bit, right? I mean, we see the deficit is just ballooning, right? And I think over the next year, we're going to see that a lot of these tax cuts that were promised are not making their way down to individual people. Amazon just did a $15 an hour minimum wage for all of its employees, and there was a lot of applause from the folks in power about that, but then the next day they pulled everybody's bonuses and they pulled the stock options for their employees. So people are going to start recognizing that, hey, the right hand looks like it might be giving, but then, boy, it's sure taking away a lot more real fast. And I don't think it's gonna last. I think people are gonna cry foul.
Yeah. So my last question: after we get through this cycle, at that point, does the focus turn completely to 2020, or do you think folks will stay engaged, even though next year is sort of an off year? Next year is a huge year for a lot of the counties.
It's a huge year. It's an on year for the work that I do. This
Right.
year is an off year for the work that I do, because everybody's so focused on the congressional races, and I think that those are interesting, but the real work happens at the local level. I expect that there will definitely be some fall off. There always is. But what I really hope is that people are starting to recognize that this ship only floats if we're all in there paddling together. It doesn't work if there's only a few people participating.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the time, as always, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you again either before Election Day or soon thereafter. A lot of interesting things going on.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much, Josh.
Yep.